Hello, hello. Welcome to our afternoon sessions. Getting us back from lunch is Linda Gorman. Linda is in Denver from Boston, where she is a developer for Upstatement, focusing on building out editorial sites. She also has a background in journalism, so I am looking forward to her insightful presentation on the admins are users too. So thank you very much, Linda.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming back from lunch. My talk is called Admins Are Users Too, but it could equivalently be called Building Better Editor Interfaces, because that's what I'm going to talk about. When we're making websites, we think really hard about what it's going to be like for the end user and how they're going to find things and if they're going to feel good about it. And sometimes we spend a little less time thinking about, how the WordPress admin feels who's actually entering content. But that aspect of things is really important, and that can really be the make or break of like if the awesome features you've made get used in an awesome, smart way, or if they kind of get neglected, and also about how that editor feels towards administering the website. So that's sort of the presentation is going to be about tips and tricks for just making that better and easier, and some general ideas. A little bit about where I'm coming from. I work at Upstatement, which is a design and development agency in Boston. There's about 25 of us. We do all kinds of stuff. These are some of our clients, but in particular, we do a lot of editorial sites, and we build a lot of them in WordPress. So this is everything I'm going to talk about is kind of just from my firsthand experience and that of my coworkers in building editorial sites. We're going to have just basically two parts. Part one is overall general principles, and part two is going to be more implementation level, like how do you actually do some of these things, a little bit of our tips and tricks. So bullet number one, editor interfaces should be self-documenting. And everybody knows who's a developer how important documentation is. And if people can't find this information they need, they're going to get frustrated. They're not going to use things as they're intended to be used, or they're not going to use them at all. Documentation is so important. But the problem is a lot of times when you make external documentation, it kind of gets divorced from the thing itself and gets lost or it gets stale. I'm sure I'm not the only one who has this experience, but I've made a lot of beautiful Google Docs that no one ever saw. You get an email question that you're like, oh, this clearly indicates they've never seen my documentation. And that's always a bummer. But it doesn't have to be the case. This is kind of an example of why this is important. I made this for a client maybe 9 months ago. It's a short code for making kind of like a sidebar type of thing, and there's some options. It can be full bleed. It can have a background color. But in the 9 months since it's been deployed, it has never been used. And that's a shame. That's a waste of our resources and a waste of their resources. But it seemed like what happened was the documentation of how to use this never filtered down to the people who are actually producing content. So anything you can do to prevent this from happening is great and of a lot of value. So put documentation where it can't get lost. Don't even make that problem possible. This seems like an obvious example, but putting really detailed information in labels and instructions directly next to your fields can be a really good strategy. I think sometimes people think that's only for, you don't need to just say what the thing is, you can also give some useful metadata around it. So for instance, how long something is going to be is useful information to put on it. Maybe where something is going to be displayed in the page can be really useful. Any kind of strategic ideas. So there's no limits to what you can put here. And this kind of documentation can never get lost. No one can look at the field and not see it. So this is kind of generally a smart approach. Sorry, I went the wrong way. This is another example of a way you might approach putting documentation in the project itself. This is just a pretty simple example of adding a submenu page to the admin bar and then adding HTML pages with documentation directly in the admin. This makes it easy for people to find useful information right away. It's also a way of getting your documentation under version control. It's sort of similar to the labels. And then you kind of have that useful metadata about your documentation that you have about your code of who made this and when and why. yeah, we find this generally to be not a bad approach. This is like a different kind of documentation. This is a style guide, but putting your style guide directly on your website as opposed to some InDesign document or something that lives in Dropbox can be a nice approach. Just keeping the thing, the thing that's being documented like as close as possible to the documentation. This is another way to do that, and can be a good strategy. This is part 2 of self-documenting interfaces, is building in really good error messaging. There's nothing more frustrating than like clicking save post and like nothing happening and having no indication as to why that's the case, or like what has or has not happened. So it's okay, people are gonna make mistakes even if you make the best interfaces with really awesome instructions. People are always gonna do stuff you don't expect. And when they do, like, you want to make it possible for them to figure out what they did wrong and to give them some guidelines as to what they should do instead. The WordPress admin bar is like a really natural place to put this kind of stuff. It's going to show up on every page or whichever pages you want it to. And it knows that like error messaging is one thing, like telling people they made a mistake, but also telling people they did something right is also really helpful. Everybody likes feedback. Like, oh, I see that something happened. I see that it's what expected. Like, it feels good psychologically. This is another example of telling people sort of exactly what they did wrong and exactly what they need to do. This is using the Shortcode UI plugin, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about later. I bet you guys use it already. One final note in this general topic is that sometimes redundancy, like I think as engineers, like we're a little bit allergic to it because we don't want to repeat ourselves, like that's inefficient. But when it comes to interfaces, repeating yourself is like okay, and sometimes it's actually preferable. If there's multiple places where people could use information, like make it available in all those places. If there's multiple places where it'd be useful to do a specific task, like make it so that you can do it in those different places. I think a good example of this is already built into WordPress core is adding categories. You can add them from a categories page or you can add them right from a post because that's where you might need them. So if you're building a plugin, like don't be afraid to make that functionality available on a post page and on an independent page. That's not bad, that's good. So next, editor interfaces should be built collaboratively. So at Upstatement, when we start a project, we typically have one or more engineers. We've got a creative director, we've got designers, and then we've got sort of our client or end users. And this might be what your team looks like, or it might look completely different. But odds are good that you have a bunch of different people who have different backgrounds and are working from a different set of information. And they all come with their own assumptions, and there's a really good chance that those assumptions don't quite line up. In my experience, this is the biggest source of bugs on a project. When people think like, oh, I thought I was going to be able to add multiple authors, or I don't know, all kinds of stuff. But basically, like, I can look at a design comp and come to a completely different set of conclusions than even another developer or the client who's seen that comp as well. And there's really not like a hack to fix this problem, though. I wish there was. But just don't let anything get lost. Like, talk to all those people at every stage of the process. I think sometimes, like, this admin interfaces aspect can be like, oh, that's the engineer's job. Like, we're going to do the design and then hand it off. They're going to do that. Then the end user is going to get it and learn how to use it. But don't let that be the case. Like, talk to your designers, talk to your end users at every stage of the process. And expose work in progress if you can. This I know applies a little bit more specifically to kind of an agency world where you're starting from scratch, but I hope there's some application for you guys as well, even if you work more in-house. When we start a website, we like to get like a staging site up really quickly, like in 3 weeks in, even if there's only like, you know, an article page built or a home page, and get editors in right away, like entering content and testing things out. It kind of serves two functions. One is that it's like a little bit of training, you know, in progress, like so you don't have to do a big push at the end, like they're learning as you go what the tools are that you made for them and how to use them. And kind of secondly, just that you can get feedback like right away in real time. And that's incredibly useful. Like if they're like, wow, this was confusing, I didn't really get this, that may guide like your future development. And you can revise like when you really have the time and space to change direction. Final note here is speak the same language that your end user is speaking. We have a certain background as engineers, and sometimes I'll look at a comp and I'll be like, oh, that text is in the lower right corner of the topper. I'll call it lower right topper text 2. But the end user might be like, oh, that's the deck. And it should be called the deck in the admin if that's what it is. So if it's an abstract, call it an abstract. Talk to your people, like use the language they're using, because that is generally going to produce a better result. And this is my third of 3 principles, is that editor interfaces should be uncluttered. I think you could also say succinct. Showing a bunch of features you don't need can make it harder to find the things you actually do need. It can also make it easier for people to make a mistake. I hope I'm not the only one who's gotten an email like this. But this was when I was first starting like my web development career. I made a website for a sandwich shop in my hometown of Wilmington, Delaware. There was a slider plugin on the homepage. And I got this email and she was like, like the homepage is totally messed up. There's a huge hole in the middle. And it turned out like she was trying to add a new photo to the slideshow, and she actually totally deleted the slider. And that wasn't on her, that was on me. Like, she shouldn't have had that capability. So I think that's kind of a good example to always be aware of when you're giving roles and capabilities to people and exposing things in the admin. Don't show them extra stuff they don't need or stuff that they shouldn't use. WordPress is kind of built for you to do that, which is awesome. This is some code that my coworker wrote, just hiding comments. Lots of projects have comments, but lots don't. You know, some projects have taxonomies and hierarchical relationships, and some don't. Like, I've certainly been asked by clients of like, what do I do with this parent field? I'm like, nothing. Please don't do anything. So if you can just hide that stuff using WordPress hooks, that is generally not a bad strategy. Or better yet, hide it through being really thoughtful with your roles and capabilities. You can do this with what's built in. You can define custom roles. And there's also plugins that handle this. There's one called Members that's really good. So figure out exactly what your users need and give that to them, and don't give them any more. You're not like, it's not that you don't trust them, you do. It's just you're helping them do their job better. And this is kind of in a separate vein, but I think it belongs under this heading as well. Flexibility is great in a website. And that's why you build the interface, so that people can do all these different things with what you've made, use different modules, etc. But sometimes flexibility isn't good past a certain degree. Like, if you've made a set of modules that only look good in a certain order, don't make it so that they can be placed in any order. It's not good for the end user. That's not good for you showcasing your design. Don't make anything possible that you really would rather not happen. Protect the designer's intentions. It's okay. Some things kind of are a little high touch, and that's not necessarily bad. It's okay to kind of understand that and act based on that. This is a site we made for Cornell maybe 6 months ago, and we had this sort of custom topper with this copy they had given us, and they were like, oh, well, what if we need to edit it down the line? We really need to be able to edit it. And we kind of pushed back, and we were like, well, if you're only going to edit it once every 2.5 years, it's okay to do that in code. This topper was designed for this copy specifically. It may not look as good with something else. If you add something else, it should be a little art-directed and a little bit thought about. It's okay to say no sometimes to that request for more flexibility, even though you feel like you're being a jerk. You're not being a jerk. All right, this is going faster than I thought. So part 2 is some implementation tips and tricks. The first thing I referenced earlier is Shortcake, which is a great plugin. I know there's people at this conference that contribute to this. It's just a way to add some UI to your shortcodes, which tend to be something that are a little bit dense and kind of need some education around to explain. So something like this can make them more intuitive and discoverable within the interface that's already there. And it's easy to do. This is a little bit of code from a project I did of like a recipe gallery. This is an especially good approach for like If you're embedding like a post within, or if you're embedding an image, finding a media ID or a post ID is kind of arduous, and you don't really want to make your users go through that. Second thing, this seems, I know, almost too obvious, but Advanced Custom Fields has a field type called tabs. Use them. I didn't know about this feature until somewhat recently, and now I'm crazy about it. It's really useful to not show everything on the page at once. Like if you look at this page on the front end, like you can kind of clearly distinguish these sections, and it's useful to have that kind of match up in the back end to be like, oh, I can see that that's the About section. It's really easy to find the field that I actually need to update to get where I'm going. Next, I have using visuals. Some things are easily described with words, but a lot of things are not. I think stuff like this, like layout stuff, you can write like to up header, and maybe they'll get what that means, but maybe not. And something like this, I think, is a lot more intuitive to just look at it. This is also kind of an example of collaborating with your design team. Like I kind of had this idea to illustrate things more visually, and I talked to my designer. I was like, can you like make some little icons? And she did, and that kind of creates a certain amount of visual continuity and sort of harmony between the back end of the site and the front of the site, which is yeah, really useful, easy to look at, easier for the user to grok. And the way I implemented that, I just used ACF has many hooks, and this is one of them for loading a field right before it gets displayed. It gives you some information that you can then sort of replace if you need to. And next I have a quick slide about providing some feedback, design feedback, sort of programmatically through your admin tools. So this is like a little plugin I made for a client. We had a design that had like really big type for the headlines, and it looked awesome. But then after we deployed it to the client, we like noticed they were writing these like huge headlines, and everything would get pushed below the fold, and it kind of broke the design, and it just didn't look like what we had imagined. So we made this to just give them like just a little bit of extra guidance of really what to do. Like we didn't want to make a hard stop. That's something you can do with lots of plugins, is say like no more than 22 characters. But if a person's name is a character longer, like there's nothing you can do. It is what it is. The content is king and should be placed first. So this, I think, can be kind of a good strategy. Stuff like this is pretty easy to build in WordPress. You can leverage hooks. This is just like a little bit of JavaScript. Like if you have things, decisions, like information that you really want, I guess this could kind of be the thrust of this whole talk, but if there's information you really want to convey to your users, don't just tell them, and like don't just write it in a Google Doc. Like put it right in the interface, and if you can, put it in an interactive way. Because I think that's like, you can't overstate how valuable that is. And I've spoken really quickly, and now I'm at my question slide, and it's only been 20 minutes. But please talk to me either now or after. Like, I think a lot of you guys bring a perspective that I just don't have, which is of like actually being in the newsroom and actually using these tools long term. Like we get to work with people as we're building their product, but sort of after it's out in the wild, we don't get as much information. So I would be interested to know your guys' perspective, or other developers who also do this stuff. What do you do that works or doesn't work?
Thanks, Linda. Yeah, we have like 20 minutes left for questions, so let's get all of the questions if we can. Okay, I'm going to come around with the mic.
Hi.
Hey.
I have actually a question and a follow-up. So the first question was whether or not you've experimented with like requiring fields at all, or whether or not you just rely on them to know what they need to enter.
I think requiring fields is a good idea, like if they are truly required. I think, ideally you want to kind of build things in a way where they can be flexible and like it'll look good with an image or without an image. But if the design is broken without an image, yes, by all means require the field. So then at least they'll get some indication of like, this is supposed to be here, it's wrong if it's not here.
Okay, so the second part of my question has to do with, you mentioned using maybe like more verbose labeling for
Yeah.
fields and things. How do you find the balance between keeping your interface clean by having fewer options with more inline docs?
Yeah, that's a really good point and a totally valid concern. I think it's sort of a judgment call because it is true that if you put too much stuff in there, then people won't read it at all. So you have to be somewhat concise still. I think like 2 lines, like you don't really want to have more than 2 lines in there. You want people to actually use the stuff. So I think that's kind of like a rule of thumb.
Well, Drew asked my question, so I'll invent another one. But it is true that WordPress, both .com and .org, spend a long time on site management, site layout, and much less time on the writer's experience or the editor's experience. And you know, everything you bring up was really valuable. Just to expand on what Drew said, you're not the only meta box in there. You know, ACF has theirs, and Yoast SEO has theirs, and that's really a balance. But that was asked and answered, so I'll go on to what about errors? That's another problem because you don't know where they're going to you don't know whether to put it up top or put it in your box itself. And so it's great to give errors, but is it going to be, where is that error going to occur, especially when you don't know where they're going to put your meta box?
Yeah, that can be a challenging thing because sometimes if it's too far below the fold, it's easy to miss an error message. I think if you can, it's good to like send people directly to the error message. We made like a kind of a recipe plugin for a website about a year ago, and that's how we handled it with the error messaging. Of like there was just like a little bit of JavaScript if you made a mistake, just to like zing you right back to where the error was, so it was easy to find. But that's a fair question. Yeah, I think you can't be sort of too obvious with that kind of thing.
So I think a balance that we all try to straddle is when to build something sort of the WordPress way in the right way, and when we might be able to sort of circumvent and get away with doing something quicker. How do you sort of balance that in your interfaces, trying to make things congruent, but also try to get things out the door?
Yeah, that's a constant struggle. I think to the degree that you can kind of work with the way things are intended to be used, that is worth a little extra time because you just don't know what the future brings. Like our designers have a lot of technical skills, and one of them came and was like, oh, I changed the CSS class on the editor view so that it fills up the whole screen, and like it definitely was cool and easier to look at, but I kind of was a party pooper, and I was like, no. Because like you don't know what's going to come in the next release. Like if WordPress wasn't intended for that part of it to necessarily be a flexible interface, so don't hack it. We're going to hand off the site and they're going to use it for another 4 years. You kind of have to have that sort of long-term perspective.
So the other people were talking about the meta boxes and floating around. One of the things that we've looked at doing is using the areas on the page as opposed to the meta box. And I wanted to get your take on it, and maybe if anybody else has any comments on if the flexibility of being able to move the meta boxes around trumps the ability to have a more clean page editing page.
To move them around, like sort of within the edit page. Oh, okay. I'm not exactly sure what you mean. Okay, gotcha. Like doing that in a fixed place versus having things that are flexible. Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think in general flexibility is kind of preferred. I think if you're going to sort of put it in a fixed place of like after title, if there's a really good use case for that, of like that immediate feedback, like directly connecting it to the thing it's next to, if there's that sort of strong use case for it, then it's great. But I think in general, it is nice to be able to have that flexibility to put things where you need them and collapse them and all that jazz. Does that answer your question? Sorry, I'm not sure. Thank you.
Other questions?
What have you had to work around in WordPress core, or what do you think core could do better to improve editorial interfaces?
Oh, that's a great question. I might have to think about it a little more, but I think more flexibility would be good. A pain point for me in the past is, and maybe this isn't even the case anymore, but like I've definitely hid the category box with CSS before, and I don't think that's ideal. So there's some stuff like that. I think just like the more granular control you can have is better. I've worked with some different CMSs, and in general, like it is nice to have something that's a little bit additive, and I think sometimes with WordPress you have to be a little bit subtractive of taking away things that are already there, whereas sometimes when you're really building like a totally custom site, you want to have the power to choose and add things that are there. So if I had any kind of general overall thoughts on WordPress and working with it with custom interfaces, that would be it.
Another question. I actually found it really interesting when you were talking about giving your end users a preview of what you're working on while you're working on it. Mm-hmm. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how you go about doing that. Are you hand-holding them through it, or are you just saying, hey, go to this website and look at it? Mm-hmm. And then, once they do that, what kind of weight do you give that feedback? Yeah,
that's a great question. Like, generally what we do is we'll make a deployment kind of at the end of every sprint. We sort of take an agile approach. And then we'll try and give the client, we'll give them homework. Like, we'll make a card in Trello that's like, this is what you need to do this week with the tools we just built. And sometimes it'll be really low-level stuff of like, make headers level 1 through 6, and make an image and make it left-aligned and right-aligned. And we'll make them check those things off, and then sort of at our next meeting, they'll bring up any concerns they had. So there's kind of like a opportunity for them to give that feedback kind of almost continuously.
So when you're letting them look at the site, how do you curtail the scope creep?
So tell me a little bit more about what you mean, like have them, like not having them request.
So now that they've looked at it,
yeah,
and it's purple, but now they want it blue, and they'd like this little WYSIWYG over here,
yeah, and
now all of a sudden they'd want, Susie and I had lunch last week, mm-hmm. and she was telling me about this new IoT technology, mm-hmm. and I think we'd like to throw that in too.
Yeah, that's a great question. That is like the continual challenge of like, how much feedback can you really accommodate? Because you want to address everything, but you have other stuff you need to build, and you can't just continuously iterate on this one thing. I don't think there's necessarily an easy answer to that. You kind of just have to look at the time you have. What we do a lot of is like defining things specifically and sort of itemizing them on cards, and then we just say like, which things do you want the most? And if they look at that and they're like, you know what, like it would be nice to have that like multiple authors, but really we need a homepage. So like putting the decision in their hands of like, okay, we can accommodate these things, but how important are they to you vis-a-vis other big features?
Hi. On sites that may be a little larger, in terms of admins, how many admins are you allowing, and what kind of restrictions are you putting in place?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. We don't really, we're a little bit less involved, like once the site is kind of, we've delivered it and we're gone off, so then people can kind of do whatever they want. But initially, I think it's great to just have 1 or 2 admins who are really the people who would have the knowledge to actually, like change permalinks or whatever other features they have access to. I think it's pretty situational in terms of how many people are in the organization and what kind of responsibilities they need to fulfill.
Other questions? Okay, I'll be right there.
Kind of want to put you on the spot. What are some of the UIs that you love the most, and the ones that just make you want to tear your eyeballs out and run out of the room screaming?
Like in general, or in WordPress specifically?
In WordPress.
Ooh. I don't want to say the wrong thing. I think in a lot of places WordPress does a really good job. I think like the WYSIWYG is pretty good. It's easy for people to work within. I think in general, just like having too many things on the screen at once sometimes is the problem of WordPress and what gets confusing. Not having enough error messaging can be a bummer. Like the taxonomy term kind of editing system, I always feel like that sort of feels a little second class, like in terms of what it looks like in the admin, but in reality that's like a really important feature that people need a lot, and people tend to add meta fields to there. So I wish that felt a little bit nicer. I wish everything was a little bit more wide open in some ways. When people are looking at long-form articles, it's tough to just look at this much, and I think the distraction-free writing is like a really good tool. I wish more editors used it, but I know that like WordPress is kind of aware of that stuff. But I'll keep thinking about it, and I'll let you know if there's anything else. I do have opinions on that topic.
Have you explored using the customizer as like a complement to the admin, like the backend admin interface for more direct feedback when you're managing content?
Yeah, I think the customizer is cool, and we really haven't quite had the opportunity to use it. I would say a lot of our sites tend to be like pretty locked down design-wise, and we're not giving people too many options. And I don't know that I could be saying something incorrect here, but my impression is with a customizer, you do have to sort of write some, if you have JavaScript, like you need to do a little bit of extra work to get that working in the customizer, which I think is a little bit of a barrier to entry. But I think the customizer can be really cool. That kind of like live preview idea, like if you guys have used Craft CMS at all, like that's a really cool thing it offers, and like it'd be amazing if WordPress had something kind of comparable where you could really see your updates happening right away.
Last one, I swear. Is actually about the shortcake stuff.
Yeah.
Have you found that, I'm assuming you guys have made your own extensions of shortcake for various sites. I was wondering if there's any sort of common themes of shortcake, I don't know, views that you're using between editorial sites? Are there common shortcode or shortcake implementations that you use from site to site?
Yeah, I don't know if we have anything really custom, but I like I said before, I do think where it's most useful is kind of like photos, gallery. I think it would be awesome if shortcake had kind of like a flexible repeater kind of thing, because that's like a use case that comes up a lot. We don't know how many of things will be in this list, but it would be awesome if we could use the shortcake plugin for it.
And the follow-up for that is, I think before something like shortcake was around, it was sort of common that you would build a thing over here, and then you'd have to like drop it in with a blind shortcode over here,
Yep.
right? And so the difference now is that you can preview it or configure it in place instead of having to do it in another place. Have you found that that's helpful, keeping your editors all in one place?
Definitely. Yeah, I think that's like exactly the use case for it. And still there are cases where like we've done some stuff with embedding graphs like in a WordPress post, and that's something where we'll make someone go to another post and create it and add the data points and then embed it. But if it's just like an image, you don't want to make people go to the media library and look up an ID to paste it in. Yeah, I think to keep editors kind of in the place where they are is an awesome thing.
Anything else? All right.
I don't know if any of your projects involved data journalists, and so they're like often developers themselves or close enough to it, so they may have some special needs and certainly more needs than your average article writer. Have you worked with many of them and had to solve their problems?
I wish I could say we have more. We've definitely done some kind of data-driven visualization sorts of projects. I think the challenge is always like having the right kind of data that can be visualized in a simple way. That's something a lot of times we'll work with like a freelancer who's an expert in D3. We just did a project for Everytown for gun safety called Law Atlas, which is like a really cool data viz project. But yeah, we're always thinking about like how to build better tools for data journalists. The site where we did the embeddable graphs was the New American Economy site, NAE, which is a super cool site, but the graphs are very basic. They're simple pie charts and like graphs, like bar graphs. And I would love to be able to build something that would offer like more power and flexibility to data journalists. I think that's a really powerful use case, and hope to do more with it.
We have about 4 minutes, so last call.
Cool. No, thanks. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you, Linda.